Welcome, everybody, both those joining us physically here today and those joining us digitally. My name is Elena Troschenko, and I work with the Global Research Program on Inequality that is organizing this session at Day Zero together with the wonderful Bergen Global. The topic of the SDG Conference Bergen 2023 is a just transformation to a sustainable future. But building just and sustainable societies entails thinking about the grand challenges of our time. One of these grand challenges is the green transition. Countless reports, among them also the most recent report, Crisis of Inequality by UNRISD, have underlined that the boundaries of our planet Earth have been exceeded, meaning that the outer limits at which humanity can continue to develop sustainably have been crossed, with disastrous ecological and social consequences. While the climate crisis and climate emergency has been declared over and over again, our present is still characterized by an increasing extraction of various forms. Tackling the ongoing climate crisis requires a global shift away from the extractive fossil fuel industries, that is, green transition. However, the challenges related to the green transition are numerous. Our current level of consumption, expectations of a constant supply of affordable energy, disappearance of workplaces, livelihoods, and sources of energy in a global system that heavily relies on oil industry. Green transition thereby confronts us with a wide range of difficult choices, decisions, and dilemmas, especially if this transition is to be framed as just and fair. This session will explore questions raising at the intersection of such topics, and we will touch upon subjects of green transition, climate change, oil industry, labor, and union work. As a starting point for today's discussion, we have a wonderful documentary, a short film entitled Talking Union, Talking Climate, which is directed by Vivian Price, who is also with us today. Vivian is from California State University, Dominguez Hills, and her work has focused on how workers, unions, and communities are thinking about and acting on transition away from fossil fuel economy. Welcome, Vivian. We also have several panelists joining us for the conversation. Mariana Betty is anthropologist from the University of Bergen, and she has worked in Kenya, exploring how the oil operations have affected social relations there. And her current work is related to another aspect of energy industry, namely the transport of oil and gas. We also have two panelists joining us digitally. Ragnhild Frengdahl is also a social anthropologist working at the Western Norway Research Institute, and her work has focused on energy industry and climate change and the way they affect local communities, particularly in the north of Norway. Welcome, Ragnhild. And we also have the pleasure of having Austin Abloh joining us digitally. Austin is a geographer at University of Ghana and has natural resource governance as one of his main research areas. He has also worked extensively on labor practices and relations in Ghana's gas and oil industry. Thank you all for joining us today. A couple of practical things before we start our conversation. So just to let you know, this session is being recorded and it will be published on SDG Conference platform. And we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the event, so please feel free to pose your questions and send them through the chat option. But returning to the topic of our conversation today, Vivian, would you like to shortly introduce the film and the context and your work before we screen the film to our audience?
Thank you, and thanks so much, Alina, for inviting me here, and to all the people at Global Bergen and University of Bergen and the SDG organizers in general. So it's really an honor to be here. My background has been in labor activism, and I did work as an electrician, a union electrician, for 3 years in the refinery and then many more years in the construction industry. So I have maintained some of my contacts with the unions in that area. And it was because of those contacts and also my work with WAGE, work in a greening economy that's based at the University of Oslo and Oslo Met, that we were able to put together focus groups and research that led us to making this film, Talking Union, Talking Climate, which is a film about the views of oil workers in California, Norway, and Nigeria.
But I think we're ready
Very
to
good.
screen a film. I think, can I hope?
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, what's up, man? Charlie here
Okay, Charlie.
Hello,
from Los Angeles.
Wow, that's great.
Christian from Norway here. Hello.
Christian
Yeah,
from Norway. Okay. Nigeria.
yeah.
I'm Didi. I'm calling from Nigeria. I'm Didi. DIDI.
How's it going, man?
No problems. We're doing fine.
Okay. So where do you
I'm
work
really.
at?
Yeah, what I work at basically, I work with an engineering firm, oil field engineering firm.
Okay.
I am a fluids engineer, fluids. So I'm basically into drilling.
Is it onshore
okay.
or offshore, Diddy?
Offshore, yeah.
Okay, so you
Offshore, offshore, onshore, deep offshore, everywhere.
Okay.
That's what I do.
So
Okay.
do you work for you?
Yeah. Yes. For years, I've been a member of the union since being a member of the senior staff. I've been in the Pengasan, we call it the Petroleum and Natural Gas Senior Staff Association of Nigeria, Pengasan. For some 6 years within my years of service in the union, I was the chairman of what we call CBA Review Committee, which is the Collective Bargaining Agreement Committee, CBA, Collective Bargaining Agreement. So basically what I do is just review line items, get information from my members and what they think it should be, and then we work on it and then present it to General House. It becomes a guide usually for the executive while negotiating for increased pay and all that stuff.
Okay. So you've been busy.
But how's the union over there? Is it? Are you strong?
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah.
We're pretty strong. Everybody's union at my where I work at, right? And then we started connecting with the other facilities, the other refineries. So even though they're competitors, right? It's still the same union. So we all get to work.
Yeah. Yeah, we are there. Here's the organization. It's like I would say 99.5% offshore. Yeah. So everybody is in some kind of union. We are part of the biggest union. So yeah.
So I'm the chair of the Next Gen committee.
Yeah.
I'm also in the grievance committee.
Yeah.
And I'm a union steward. So I get a little busy sometimes with the union.
Yeah. But your bosses, it's okay for you to do like 3 hours union work today if you want to, or do you have to do it on your free time, or?
No, so we're always so how do I say it? So where we work at, we're employees, right, of the company.
Yeah.
Or we're union members. So at any given moment, an issue can happen, and I automatically transition myself to steward.
Yeah.
So at that point in there, I'm a steward, and I can hash it out with the company.
Yeah.
And at that point, we're equal to each other. And that's a right that we have. So there's no way that a manager can tell me get back to work. It's kind of like, no, we're equal and we're gonna settle this now.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So is it like that over there?
Yeah, when you have so many members, you have one full-time job. I work full-time, and if I pass like 400 members, I get the second guy working full-time also.
I don't really know too much of Norway, but I was learning that obviously the country depends a lot on oil export.
Yeah, we do. It's like 2% of the oil and 3% of the gas of the world is from Norway.
But you guys depend on it financially, but not in your country, right? You guys are...
The tax from the companies is like sky high, but they pay 78% tax of the oil to the government. So we have that in our, let's say, an account, and all that money is goes to all the people in Norway. So the tax here from the oil is very high, but it's a lot of money in the business. So we have to the government take care of 78% of the money from it. So yeah, it's like our Norwegian pension.
Okay.
Or what do you call it, yeah.
So the companies, the corporation pay 78% tax?
78, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
Right here, I don't think corporations pay any taxes. So my next question was, so we're union, and the company that I work for, they probably hate us. They don't want us there.
It looks like similar experience.
So what kind of dynamic do you guys have with the companies that you guys work with?
For us in Norway, it's very good because the companies see the how important the union are for the business. Like yesterday, we have a thing called third part cooperation. Is the employees, or let's say the union, the company, and the state of Norway. So we three-part situation. And like yesterday, the union and the big oil companies are working together with the government to come to an agreement with the tax package, as I talk about, and together we help each other. So for us up here is very good, but of course there is someone who can fuck up the whole thing. If you're a guy who want to fight, you can make a lot of noise in your local club or yeah, whatever. But the thing is to have people in work, and yeah, so we kind of working for the same thing, that people should have a safe and and good job. Yeah.
That's not the case over here. If you gave them an option and say, hey, do you want us here or you want us out? They'll probably say, we want you out.
In Nigeria, I see the whole of the relationship much more at different layers of the union, of the national union. The national union is made up of government companies like the National Oil Corporation, and then we also have the big oil multinationals, and then we have third-party companies, small companies like Schlumberger, name it, Halliburton, and all that stuff. That's the levels we operate here. At the level of the third-party companies and big oil multinationals, the union leaders are seen as troublemakers. If a union is seen as troublemakers, they want you out.
About the climate, can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I work in a refinery, right? So we refine the crude oil that we get.
Yeah.
So from there, where I work at, we get a lot of attention, and there's a lot of people that want to shut us down, right? They don't believe in fossil fuels at all, right?
No.
Which is fine, right? They're entitled to their opinion and everything, right? But I started getting involved with my union as far as, we need to be at the table. If climate change is going to happen and infrastructure is going to evolve,
yeah,
then the union needs to be involved there as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know how they say, right? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I decided to step up, along with a couple of my union brothers, to start the conversations with local government, right? Local communities, to talk about like, hey, we want climate change too. We want a just transition, but we want to make sure that it fits us the right way. Have you been to meetings with politicians or other environmental groups that want to shut you guys down?
No.
No? Okay.
but they talk about it a lot in the media, and in my opinion, they could get too much space in there, and we talked about yesterday also that all the oil guys, the oil business, and the gas business, and they don't get too much attention, because if there's a green guy, they have been heard all the time in the media, and they don't see how important this is for us Norwegians, with all the money that we and stuff we develop for this kind of business, and also going from oil and gas over to the more climate neutral way to run it, and we can use a lot of technology for doing windmills, like Equinor, who is the biggest oil company in Norway. They made a lot of windmills out in the ocean.
Yeah.
And you couldn't do that if they didn't have the money for it to do it. But they're like talking about in the media, okay, when are we going to shut down? We can't shut down fast enough, and so on. But we're like, hey, we have to, we need this stuff, the oil and gas, in the future for many years. We can't just shut it down, but we can start on the change will come in not 1 year, not 10 years, but I don't know, in many years in the future, it will be a full change, of course.
You know, and there's always been like, what I think is like, you can't shut down the fossil fuel industry completely, right?
Yeah.
You can push them to maybe mitigate, you know what I mean? And do changes within whatever facility, right, to make it better, right? But currently, and I think I saw a couple of articles right now, because there's, Tesla is fighting a new company called Nikola.
Yeah.
About, they're really pushing the electrical car usage, right?
Mm-hmm.
But having electrical cars in the street is not going to be the solution to climate. What's happening in Nigeria? What are the talks? What is the media saying? What are the environmentalists saying about climate change?
Well, from my own personal perspective, climate change is real. In the Delta, where we're basically having increases in sea levels. From where I talk, because I am in the countryside, that's my home, my ancestral home, and that's where I'm talking from now.
And a lot of destruction happens almost every year in Nigeria due to flooding that people have never seen before.
If I just peep out of my window, I've seen a gas flare, and it's been there since 1962.
You say a flare?
Yeah.
Wow.
Gas flare.
Wow.
So we're having because I meet with the local chiefs, and we review our history, who we are, and what has happened over the years, and there's a lot happening here. I just can't tell you that. But at the level of the unions, here the unions have no organized response to the issues of climate change. They're very much more trapped in the issues related to bread and butter. Basically, the union has no basic position concerning climate change in Nigeria. Union is not in the picture, because the union is seen much more as an appendage of government.
But is the Nigerian government pushing for a change, or they're just neutral?
The Nigerian government is not neutral. They are an investor, and they're also regulated. You don't expect the Nigerian government to be fair. They flouted court decisions and dismissed some judges who were involved in making the right judgments in courts. So, and also an investor. You cannot regulate yourself, especially if your interests are involved in dollars, in oil dollars.
film, and I think it really lends itself as a very good and fruitful starting point for many conversations. But I wanted to start by asking our panelists to maybe comment on the film. So could you please share your thoughts and insights about and reflections on the film and how the topics addressed in the film also relates to your line of work? Mariana, maybe we could start with you.
Yes, I really enjoyed this small documentary. Thank you very much, Vivian. And thank you again, Elina, for inviting me today. I think it is important to show how the pervasive industry of oil and gas is so yet different. I mean, the realities of oil and gas industry is so different in the world. So you pick three very evocative examples of how things work very differently in three different countries, three different continents, which have completely different governments, completely different interaction between the government and the oil industry. But also it was interesting, and three different legacies of oil in the country. But of course, the same, all these differences were compensated by the fact that these three workers, oil workers, active members of their own respective unions, spoke the same language. So they were talking in terms of rights, in terms of protecting each other, in terms of making the voices of the workers heard in their ways, I mean, in the way that they can. So the strategies, of course, are different, but the language of the oil workers across the world are the same. So I think this was very impressive. And I would actually like to have more examples from across even other underrepresented countries that export oil and gas. These three, California, Nigeria, and Norway, are like very symbolic, right? But and also, like, it was interesting to see how we got the we got to see two segments of the oil and gas industry: the refinery, but also the extraction sites. Now, from my point of view, what lacked in a way was the transport of oil and gas, which is the most invisible probably sector of the oil and gas industry. But we can talk about this later.
Thank you, Mariana. And I like also always the anthropologist contributing with the comparative
Yes.
element. To our digital panelists, Ragnhild, would you like to share your thoughts?
I can start. Yes. First of all, thank you, Vivian, for a really, really interesting film, and also thank you, Elina, and others for the invitation to be here today. I also, like Mariana, found it really interesting how like these three very different countries also have so much similarities, but obviously also differences that come up during the conversation. And so, in particular, kind of the strength of the union in Norway is quite different from the other two examples, in that it's much more it's a much more direct negotiation between the three parties of the company and the state and the union, so that gives them a different leveraging power. And I think it's obviously a topic that's touched on there, but that also I know is explored more in the other wage research. One thing that I think is interesting, obviously, like my research has been based mostly in Norway and petroleum in northern Norway in particular. And there, the discussion is also very much tied to, the tax is mentioned by Christine, by the Norwegian petroleum worker, and it's something that's also very important in local terms when it's like onshore refineries, but it's also a question of like how that tax is distributed across the country. I also found it interesting how obviously a lot has changed in the conversation since this video was recorded in a way. So this, how in the unions in Norway, the Congress of the biggest of LO last year had a resolution that was voted through unanimously by all the different parties. It was kind of a compromise between the unions that are very tightly connected to the oil and gas industry, like Industri Energi, and then also the rest of the public sector unions, etc., that kind of agreed on that, yes, we need a stable level of activity because otherwise they would never pass a resolution, but also that needs to be combined with new industries, CCS, hydrogen, offshore, and that the resources that are to be extracted must be sustainable economically and in a climate wise. So I think there's an interesting kind of shift also going on in the unions, even in Norway, that maybe we can discuss a bit more during the conversation, because obviously it shows the importance of the unions for workers, but also for a just transition, but that what a just transition means is different in the three different contexts.
Definitely, and I think this your point about the nuances also and the complexities inside the unions is very interesting. So I hope we'll get to come back to that a bit later. Austin?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is an interesting documentary, very short, very informative. What is remarkable is that, like the other panelists said, we're looking at workers from three different contexts, three different continents, but with a lot of overarching issues that cut across these various contexts. And I think on the issue of the people involved in this documentary, I think we would have benefited a lot also from having a lot more clearer segment, for instance, between onshore, midstream, downstream, and various, like the transport segment as well represented, and we have a lot more nuanced discussion. But I think that this gives us a lot of issues to discuss, to reflect on with regards to energy transition and green transition in general, and just transition, and what does it mean for different people, right? In Nigeria, for instance, the person said, look, the unions don't care about climate change, right? It's about bread and butter, it's about employment, it's about income. And so if you go to countries where there is high unemployment, where there is high youth unemployment, where there is a lot of graduate unemployment and underemployment, then the discussions about energy transition is quite different, and what it means for them is quite different. And I think that the three workers in this documentary really reflect those dynamics about context and what transition means for different people. That even the way the unions are organized in Norway is completely different from in US and Nigeria and many other countries across the globe. And that also reflects in the kinds of debates and discussions that go on regarding energy transition and the relationship that exists between hydrocarbon industry and the whole discourse on climate change and energy transition. So I think there are a lot of interesting issues that we can come back to as the discussion goes on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Austin, for sharing your thoughts with us. Vivian, would you like to reply to some of the comments, or maybe,
Yeah, I think all of you have brought up important points, that transport is another sector that really deserves to be represented. Also, many other countries have slightly different perspectives and also situations, right? And even say within the United States or possibly within different parts of Africa and Scandinavia, there are nuances and also, as you pointed out, Ragnar, the change. This is a COVID film. These workers, we imagined, would actually meet each other. And Charlie, who has become a friend, did come to Norway last spring, but Didi was not able to come yet. And it ended up where they had one Zoom talk where they were all together. This was the first time they ever met each other. It was in 2020, right as COVID hit. So what's, I think, dynamic about this film is that it is an unusual, possibility of having this very spontaneous, open conversation but, among workers who, as you say, speak the same language in some ways, but also have quite enormous differences between them. And they do bring those out in a very unpretentious and spontaneous way, so that you see Charlie's surprise about the 78%. Of course, we know in Norway, as you mentioned, Ragnhild, how is that distributed? To what extent are the exploration fees also, not included in that? But in the United States, we don't have national health care. We don't have a support system similar to Nigeria, ironically, that the workers are so insecure. Austin, you bring up the point of the difficulty of security of workers and in places that have high unemployment. Well, in the United States, there's high inequality. And we have very few really good, strong unionized jobs. They happen to be male dominated. They happen to be in the fossil fuel area. And this is another problem, is that the way work is valued in terms of nationality, in terms of sector, is also, very much related to your work, Alina, in terms of inequality and reflecting on, how do we value work? How do we value what everybody contributes to society? And with this domination of the fossil fuel economy in the world that we're, really all reliant on, whether it's Norwegians for their wonderful, support system, although there's other ways to understand how that's supported, and there could be other possibilities for a rich country to transition. It's still very delicate about how do you phase out, and then what happens to the workers, what happens to the communities that are dependent on the profits from oil, or who've never gotten any benefits, as in Nigeria. Even though the economy is dependent on oil, the government, unlike Norway, does not, and the companies are not held accountable to share their profits with the people.
Thank you. I want to return to the workers, the main characters of the film, and that you also now mentioned, as the film provides an insight into perspectives of the oil workers and their narratives around in the debates of green transition. And as I know that also the project that this film is a part of has been concerned about highlighting the perspectives of workers. So could you, the panelists, say a bit more about how workers in your context relate to the fossil fuel industry and green transition debates? What are the narratives and contradictions and concerns of the workers, and how do they imagine themselves in this transition? Austin, I know that you have been working on labor relations in Ghana's oil and gas industry. Maybe you could start, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm right here. I think that's a good question and a good point. That I think the whole discussion and debate on green transition and just transition and decarbonizing society must be situated also in the broader issues of labor and employment. And I think that that is something that is not really driven in the research space, right? Because in many instances, you realize that university graduates with petroleum engineering degree is concerned about getting a job in the oil industry, right? And if you look at the instance of Nigeria and comments from the DD, for instance, we have a similar situation in Ghana that labor is precarious. People are given very precarious terms of employment. And in that context, there are very unfair labor practices that people spend a lot of time thinking about their job security than any issue of energy transition. And if you compare it to Norway, where there is a lot more effective social security system, and in terms of unemployment benefits, NAV, and support for people who don't have job, and a lot more robust social system, then people can speak up. People's views on hydrocarbon industry and decarbonizing society is a bit more different. If you compare it to Nigeria and the case of Ghana and also US, for instance, then the whole debate on energy transition is missing in the context of job insecurity, in context of unemployment and all of that. And I think that is a perspective that we can push a little bit more in the research space. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Austin. Marianne, I know you have spent a little time on shipping boats, shipping gas and oil with the workers, talking with workers, people working on the boats. Do you want to share some
Yes, so
thoughts on that?
I can. Well, now this green transition, when you think about the adjective green now, is like everywhere, right? So in the industry, you talk about green technology, green energy, semi-green energy, green in the industry. So it's the workers, I mean, the sailors on board these tankers, they are aware of the tendency of their own shipping company to want to green their industry, which is quite polluting, right? And they think they are part. They think the value. They know. They see the value in it, because actually, greening the industry means, in practical terms, that you are making you digitalize system, you electrify machines, and you make new automated forms of machines, making the sector more efficient and safer. Let's say. So this is sort of like the mantra, and they see this in practice. Now, is this working? Then it's another issue, right? It's debatable. But they talk about their position in the green transition, like they are very clear that when you ask them what is your role in climate change, they usually distanciate themselves from the oil and gas industry, since they are a hybrid sector, right? They transport the oil and gas, but they're not on the extraction sites, or they're not in the refineries, but they are part of the whole value chain. So the majority of them distanciate from it, and other, they actually say that they are moving towards transition with their work, because they transport in LNG, which is this transitional form of energy that will enable the final transition to renewable forms of energy. So they see themselves as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Or it would be debatable also, like these workers that we've seen in your documentary, right? They don't see themselves as part of the problem. They actually see themselves as part of the solution, because they say the industry have the money, have the resources to enable the transition. And we work for this industry, so you can't just eradicate us. So the green transition is possible because of us, in a way.
Yeah, this also talks to the film as one of the participants also say we are part of the solution, right? So how the workers position themselves in these transitions is really interesting. Vivienne, how other workers that have been part of your project, or the workers that you have shown them film to, are reacting to it and positioning themselves in these debates? Does it vary a lot across across different sectors and places? And yeah,
Right.
could you tell a bit more
Well,
about that?
First of all, I'd like to just say, I think the Norwegians really see themselves more as part of the solution. I think that Americans maybe think of themselves as not wanting to lose their jobs. And, you know, maybe they are concerned with seeing that their industries mitigate. And Didi is sort of an extraordinary person because he's both an environmentalist and a fluids engineer. So he's also really, as he says, you know, oil has corrupted his country and has damaged the people's livelihoods. So we do need to distinguish how each person, each political economy, and how individuals also come to describe themselves. And yet, I think, you know, this is the thing is people, if you ask, how do workers respond to this film? We've just finished it, so it's just being released. And the little that we've shown it has been, you know, mainly in Norway. And it's been, oh, you know, yes, we see that our industry can be, you know, part of the answer. And there's a lot of hope, right? And there's a lot of also hope in carbon capture, which has been so far not been able to be brought up to scale. And it's been heavily invested in the last few decades, and now is being reinvested in many different parts of the world, including Norway and California. There are different aspects of carbon capture, but what the technologies are, you know, what is green hydrogen? Is LNG really a transition or a way to maintain the old fossil fuel? So I had to, you've spoken very, about very important topics. I wanted to recognize that. One of the things that reasons we made the film and the hope is, on the one hand, to stimulate discussions among workers. Because, again, I'm most familiar in the American situation, but many of our labor councils, depending on whose members are really powerful, also are very defensive of their jobs, right, for their members. Again, as I mentioned, you lose your job in the United States, you lose your childcare. You might lose everything. You might be out on the street. So it's understandable that both the building trades, who are very involved in gas and oil, as well as the steel workers or other refinery workers, whether they're unionized or not, are quite defensive about this. But hopefully, hearing these different points of view, it gives you a space for discussion. Instead of condemning workers and making them feel, you know, like the villains. And this has been a discussion within Norway, right? The heroes have become, you know, the villains in some ways. To really understand that there's space between the industry and the workers, and that workers are trying to create good jobs for their families. And how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that doesn't maintain the status quo, that looks forward and presents a way that all unions and all workers can work with government and elected officials and others to create a better economy for everybody, and to, you know, attack the inequality that is fostered in some ways by the fossil fuel industry, even in Norway, where many of the workers are migrant workers, foreign workers. They don't get the same kind of salaries. And the other thing is that environmentalists, I think, are an important audience for this film because, you know, youth, we've talked, I'm a professor, I teach a lot of students of many ages, are very worried about the future, you know, and environmentalists get, you know, are so knowledgeable about the tipping point and everything that we get very frenzied about the crisis, and we want to change things now. And yet, without understanding a worker's point of view, we are such a polarized society. We don't find commonalities. And that's another way that the film, we're hoping, Wage is really working on a dialogue with environmentalists in Norway. The Swedish trade unionists are also considering this. I'm hoping that Americans and Europeans will also find this a useful tool. And we're also working on another film that is perhaps a little bit more higher production value, not just a Zoom call, to promote a deeper look at the perspectives of these three workers.
Thank you. You touched upon one of the central elements of our conversation today about just transitions, right? And Ragnhild already, when commenting on the film, when we started our conversation, mentioned what is just transition. So I wanted to explore a bit more this topic. So what do you understand by the term, and what is, for you, is the meaning of just transition? What compromises just transition, and just in which ways, and for whom? Because there's a big difference in that. So given the context of your work, what could be seen as a successful approaches to and examples of just transitions? Ragnhild, as you touched upon this topic in the beginning, maybe you could start.
Yes, thank you. Just transition is obviously a kind of term that entails a lot of different components. And when we're talking a kind of petroleum workers, labor unions, transition perspective, then obviously it's one of the major discussions in that is like how to ensure that the jobs that, because this is a main worry for the Norwegian petroleum workers that have like very good labor agreements, have very good, like, you know, their rights are very well developed, like how to ensure that the new jobs to come are equally secure and have proper working conditions and all of these things. That's like one aspect of what a just transition entails. Then another one is like who pays the price of transition. And in some of my more recent research that is still in the energy sector, but not like on energy and impacts on local communities, but more in terms of other sectors such as wind energy. Then also it's a question, particularly in northern Norway and other parts of Norway that really go all the way down to Trøndelag and beyond. That's part of Sápmi, that's the indigenous Sami area. It's also a question of like how to ensure that the green transition doesn't become another kind of way of taking away land that's important for cultural practices and cultural and indigenous livelihoods, including reindeerherding, but also cultural practices that depend on the use of the land as not an industrial area, but as an area where nature areas are more or less intact and maintained by activities that have smaller impacts than building like major power lines or wind power. And obviously that is connected in many ways to the petroleum industry, because one of the main ways of meeting the climate targets within Norway would be to electrify petroleum installations, which requires a lot of extra electricity that also needs to come from somewhere. And one of the major wind farms that was constructed in Norway, or has been constructed in Norway, is the Fosen case, where two of the wind power plants, Storheia and Roan, were, now it's more than 500. Well, it's the verdict fell in 2021 and still nothing has happened, where the Supreme Court unanimously voted that the wind farm breaks the human rights of the South Sami reindeer herders, because they are denied the right to practice their traditional culture and traditional way of herding reindeer. And there is still no solution to that one, and yet there are other ones on the table and on being discussed as potential other wind farms and other kinds of energy infrastructure. And that raises questions also of just transition and of who and how to ensure that these processes happen in a way that don't repeat the same injustices that happened at the Fosen, in the Fosen area. So that's like two perspectives on just transition, I suppose.
That are very important points, especially how so it doesn't turn into a new exploitative industry, right? Austin, would you also like to
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that on the issue of what is just transition and for whom, I think that clearly what just transition means is going to be dependent on which context you're looking at, right? And in the Norwegian context, for instance, quite paradoxical because the Norwegian economy and their current level of development and solid social system is all a part of the oil wealth. It's all part of the hydrocarbon extraction and the way they've managed it and all of that, right? And the level of development in Norway is really in many ways related to the oil wealth. And now they are more stable, and we're talking about green transition and all of that. And if you compare it to Nigeria, Ghana, and many other countries, it's a completely non-starter for many people, right? In Nigeria, for instance, people don't have a regular electricity supply, so they have to depend on generators to supply their homes with electricity. Similar situation in Ghana. And in this context, then the question is, what are we transitioning from, right? What are we transitioning from to the green? Because if you're looking at energy supply in both Nigeria and Ghana, it's highly unstable, both for electricity. Oil prices in Ghana are unstable. They've gone up dramatically in the past few years. I mean, between 2022, the last quarter of 2022 and 2023, oil prices went up more than 100%, right? And so in this context, what are they transitioning from? And so you will realize that the issue of just transition really, for context like Norway, it makes a lot of sense when they argue about energy transition and just transition, right? But in Nigeria, where ecologies have been devastated by oil extraction, we've seen cases in Ogoni, for instance, where Shell and Total have spilled oil, and the conflict that is left up to today. Then the question is, what is just what is transition for these people? And so I do agree with Rangel that we have to also be careful that this the notion of energy transition doesn't become a new kind of buzzword for new forms of extractivism, right? New forms of exploitation. And in many contexts where developing countries are struggling with basic systems, basic supply system, electricity and all of that, then it's quite a lot more complex situation when we talk about energy transition, right? We have to also reflect on what does that mean for what are the potential risks for new forms of exploitation, for new forms of degradation, for economies that rely on oil. Nigerian economy, the Ghanaian economy, Nigeria relies heavily on oil, right? So can they actually transition with the level in which the economy is really dependent on oil? And in a lot of these situations, we realize that they are already struggling, even with the oil, with the hydrocarbon, right? So where is the point of departure? And I think that there are a lot more complex issues that we can begin to reflect on. And also, as we compare different contexts, we realize that the whole discourse of transition, just transition and green transition has to be contextual and looked at, of course, even though it's a global issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. I think very important points, both what are we transitioning from, what is the starting point and trajectories it may take, but also what we are transitioning to, right? So, and the context of these transitions. Marianne, would you also like to?
Yeah, maybe I can add something to what Ranghild and Austin said. I mean, they already touched upon very important issues, the one of who will pay for this transition, and this transition to what will transit to, right? So who will have to make the sacrifice? And of course the context. As Austin said, it's important then for us to understand what level of justice it will be in different contexts. It won't be a smooth, just transition overall. over everywhere. But also transition, we have to think that, and as the oil workers in the documentary showed us, it's not going to take overnight. It's going to take a long time. It's not going to be smooth, and it's not going to be easy. So I was thinking about 2 points here. So how to make it just. First of all, we are already living a energy crisis, a period of strong energy crisis, and it's not going to get better. So first, we think about energy supply and demand. The just transition, the just into this transition would have to make the supply stable for everyone. And we see already that this is not happening, that we have to pay high prices, extremely high prices for energy. So the demand and supply must be kept in balance, and there is the resources there to do it, because this oil company have record profits this year, right? So the money is there to incentivize that the supply is redistributed equally to everyone. But also, like, if you think about a transition, again, it entails it entails a whole restructuring of the infrastructures of our society. So the whole infrastructures that today is based on oil and gas have to be either refitted or shifted completely. And this means it will take, first of all, a lot of resources, a lot of years, and also a lot of regulations. So I give you just an example. The shipping industry is now facing with very hard sanctions or regulations on environmental regulation. So environmental regulation from International Maritime Organization are making a lot of the smaller shipping company to go bankrupt, because they cannot refit their ships in order to emit less so that means that only those big industry that will manage to restructure, they will make it through. So is this just? Is transition for everyone? So this is a point we have to think more about.
And I also find interesting your point about, there needs to be a paradigm shift as well in the way we think, also what needs to be changed. It's not just about how the energy is produced, but also how our societies are built around the energy. Vivian, would you also like to share your thoughts on just transition?
Yeah. So I was involved in the United States in a study through Labor Network for Sustainability, a group that brought environmental justice, environmentalists, and labor together to talk about economic transitions, where there were shutdowns of different industries throughout the country over the last few decades, deindustrialization, and what kinds of things made a difference, and what helped. And we found several models that were really important. But we also, a key point which Austin has made, which all of you have made, is that there's no formula. It really is about context. And it's also about democracy and how, and people who've been disproportionately affected by emissions, whether it's countries, and we know about the COP27 discussion of, loss and damages, and how countries are demanding, that there be financial accounts from the wealthy countries to countries that have been damaged over years by extraction and other colonial and post-colonial methods. But there's also, within the different contexts, the question of power, right? You can have unions, you can have communities sitting at the table, having a place. And we saw this in our study that, there were well-intentioned situations in different states, right, in the United States, especially where our federal government has been paralyzed because of, the anger that people have about high energy and the misplaced ideas of, how you can get, some kind of fairness. But at any rate, in Washington State and in Colorado, there were both two examples of very well-intentioned ideas of presenting models where everybody was at the table. But the problem was that in Colorado, the unions and the state actually and the industry sort of marginalized the communities of color and the underrepresented, disproportionately impacted communities. And so they came up with an idea which had really good, again, good intentions, the Office of Just Transition, which would attract investments that were, hopefully foster renewable energy and new industry, but did not take into account the communities. In Washington State, the communities of color and anti-poverty groups came together as a caucus and were able to really fight to make sure that there was a transition that helped workers. And there was a labor caucus and that was very forward-thinking, that brought energy workers and others together, and then built power so that each segment really had a say. And they created a very wonderful model called Washington Initiative 1631 that included people who were part of the negotiations in the implementation, in the decision-making for how the money that would be paid for by the polluters and their profits. But in the last moment of this campaign, which was very popular, this initiative, the oil companies put in $31 million and put the fear of big gas prices in voters, and somewhat narrowly that initiative was defeated. But it was a great model, and that I think that's what we do need to think of, is how in different areas of the world and in different regions, people can come together and create ideas that provide power for different, the most important sectors, that people, as the workers in this film say, that they have that they're not on the menu, they're at the table. And that there's a Climate Justice Alliance in the United States that brings a lot of indigenous people, as Ragnhild was talking about. We also have the problem of many indigenous groups in North America feeling that the new green wind and solar will be just as bad and devastating for their communities in some ways as the oil. And so again, this idea of, are we working for green growth? Are we working for a more equitable society in which maybe we have to reduce consumption, we have to have a different way of thinking about fashion and many things, right? Reimagining our future.
Yeah, you touched upon a topic that we at Group, of course, are very focused on in our work, inequalities and power and injustices. So I also wanted to talk a bit about that, and I see that we have also are starting to get some questions from the audience. So before I give the word to questions from audience, I want to ask one of my last questions, and this relates to inequalities and already things that you talked about now, Vivian, because resource extraction is embedded, of course, in global hierarchies of power and inequalities, and in many ways also participates in exacerbating these inequalities, going also back to what Austin has talked about in different contexts. And green transition in different political economies entail different starting points and different trajectories for these developments. But could you share also your insights on how inequalities and injustices relating to both extraction industry and green transition are articulated and narrated in your specific contexts? Mariana, would you like to start?
I think of course, yes, the whole the whole resource extraction is it's about inequality both at the micro level and the macro level. So if I talk from the perspective of my own fieldwork, so I can say that the most it's the workers, for example, the sailors on these tankers, they feel themselves completely neglected. And so this section of the oil and gas industry, as if we will talk more about unions later on, it's invisible. So the voices now we hear from the oil workers, they are more powerful, but we barely hear from other sections of the oil and gas industry. And I'm talking from the point of view of those who transport. So they are in the middle of the sea, maintaining the demand of energy in place, and they're never spoken about. I remember the last time I was on the ship, I asked an electrician actually on the ship to think about his role in the oil and gas economy, and he said he had an interesting answer. He was saying that he was enabling democracy. How? Because right now during the conflict with Russia and the suspension of or sanctions on Russian supply, we are becoming more and more dependent on other countries to import energy. And since this particular sailor was working on a Norwegian LNG tanker shipping, buying LNG from Texas and importing it to Europe, he was saying that he was contributing to the European Union to be less dependent on Russia, so less controlled by Russia, and therefore he was supporting the democratic project in Europe. And as a matter of fact, this electrician is Ukrainian. So it was very, he was very involved into this discussion and found this role in the industry very clear in this moment. However, if you then reason around this power imbalance and polarization, I think we heard about this word today, and we look at the power relations at the macro level. Now, of course, since the industry is shifting, right? And now with this example of LNG now being bought by another supplier rather than Russia, then you can also think how the power imbalance between continents is also changing. So it's really so powerful, this industry, that it changes power relations on a geopolitical level. So who knows what is for us in the next future, now that we are becoming more dependent. Now when we talk about Europe, right? More dependent on American LNG.
The power of oil, it's really overarching. Ragnhild?
Yes. Well, from an LNG tanker ship to the only LNG production unit in Norway, I guess. So I did most of my research in Hammerfest, which is a town at the very tip of northern Norway, pretty much, that has a population of roughly 10,000 people, and then an LNG facility. So LNG is liquefied natural gas, so rather than transporting it in pipelines to Europe as the rest of the the gas produced in Norway is, Hammerfest is so far up north in the Barents Sea that there are no pipelines, and so they constructed an LNG facility that transforms the gas to a substance that's transportable on these LNG tanker ships. And for Hammerfest as a local community, the petroleum, Snøhvit, the LNG facility opened in 2007, so it's kind of quite a recent transition to petroleum rather than away from petroleum. And then an oil field was opened in 2015. So it's these two petroleum projects that have meant a lot to the local community in the town, because a lot of with the first facility being onshore, it means that a lot of local people work at the plant, and that creates a stability for the community. It also creates a tax income for the municipality that has meant a lot for them. And so for them, it's like this inequality is kind of, Northern Norway has never participated in the petroleum adventure before, let's say, and so they feel like if we're transitioning away from oil now, you're risking the entire community in a way. Obviously, Hammerfest is an exception because it's the only municipality in Finnmark, the northernmost county, that has really benefited from petroleum. The rest of them have kind of just, I mean, some of the building industry is benefited somewhat, but the rest of the county is kind of further removed from that petroleum wealth. But for them, as a local community, it is quite an acute question of like, if Melkøya is discontinued because of the climate, then like what will they live from? And so that's a different complexity in a way, that where also the war in Ukraine obviously is created a new kind of actuality to that. When the war broke out, Melkøya was actually not in production because a fire broke out in the August 2020, and it took them quite a long time to get the production up and running again, more than a year. And so during that time, the company promised that none of the workers would be suspended or lose their jobs, and that was a very important thing for the municipality to kind of feel secure that Equinor knew what they were doing in that like interim thing. And now the government is deciding whether Melkøya should be electrified. So again, we can come back to these, like, what is transition? How does this maintain both communities, but also kind of perpetuate petroleum dependence in some ways that makes the green transition slower in some ways.
Thank you for that, Ragnhild. Austin?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think very interesting points have been raised with regards to issues of inequality and green transition. And I think that is an essential part of the discussion on green transition that we need to pay a lot more attention to. In that, when you look at the whole issue of green transition, the question we have to ask is, what is the role of states, for instance, in green transition, right? What does it mean for Shell or Total or Chevron or BP or Statoil? I think Statoil has changed name now, and Norwegian companies to be leading research in green transition, for instance, right? And you realize that a lot of the investment and research on green transition is actually coming from the hydrocarbon companies. And the critical question is, are they really interested in green transition, right? What is the role of the state? And the whole industry is the way we experience carbon lock-in. It's built around inequality, right? The hydrocarbon industry is about inequality. And the war in, Ragnhild talked about the war in Ukraine, and it's been a big windfall for Norway, for instance. For US, they now have a new market and all of that. And what we are seeing is really a change of guard. Who is the new master? Who is the new boss in town, right? And that is what is happening. And you realize that in Europe, the discussion, especially post-COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of the discussion is about diversifying European energy source, right? Who are the alternative? Where are the alternative sources of gases in Europe? Where can we get cheaper gases? And really very little about green transition. It's very little about energy transition in general. And Vivian talked about the case where companies, for instance, threaten states that, okay, we're going to increase gas prices and all of that. And so policies that are supposed to push for transition, government begin to coil back a little bit just so to ensure that there is stable gas supply, the gas prices are not very high. So at the across scale, right? Across scale or across different levels, whether transnational, national, or local level, there is a very complex power relation, but in most cases, power asymmetry in the oil and gas sector that allows it to operate the way it operates. And I think that this inequality and asymmetry will really undermine the way we pursue green transition. All right, thank you.
Thank you all for your insights, and I think it's important to draw in larger global processes taking place and events when we talk about the inequalities and injustices and transition, and as Austin also pointed out, different actors that are part of this, both states and the industry. I want to turn to the questions that the digital audience has sent in. It's quite a long one, so bear with me. So within research on climate transition, there's a lot of focus on the international arenas, such as the COP meetings and the IPCC. I'm not sure about the the shortenings, maybe you know more. But an alternative perspective will be to focus on national actors and their alliances or conflicts. One theory here is that when the labor organizations and the employer side gather around a common narrative, example, the need to invest in continued search for new oil resources, it is very difficult to launch a strong political alliance around the need for transformative change in the energy sector. What would be your comments on this angle? Would you like to start, Phoebe?
Sure. I think that's a very critical point. Just as it was coal, right? We saw that sometimes these transitions took longer because there was an alliance between, say in Germany, for example, or in different parts of Europe, there was an alliance between maybe a social democratic state and a labor union that was somewhat tied to the social democratic parties and then the companies. And so it was really drawn out. And yet there was a transition that took place, but even now we see that kind of can go into reverse with this Ukrainian war and the question of where, I mean, South Africa is another place where coal transition still is in flux, and it's understandable, again, that workers and companies can have these alliances because workers unions have made some inroads in making demands for better labor standards than in other areas of work. I think that's one of the ways that the environmentalists can really benefit from understanding workers in creating industrial policies and speaking to the state in ways that protect workers, that enlarge the space for good jobs, that promote a livelihood, a stronger support system. And in that way, again, create space between the workers and the companies so that there are opportunities for workers to feel, well, the environmentalists actually have their back, but without concrete plans, without the environmentalists understanding workers' perspectives and the perspectives of communities that are dependent on oil or LNG or, or the seafarers, for jobs, we have this paralysis and a fight, which often becomes a fight for, more right-wing government to maintain the status quo. I think in Africa, it's also interesting, and I'd like to know more about how this plays out in Africa. I was talking to Wesley earlier, who's helped bring this conference together, about even the role of, say, Equinor or other companies when they go to Africa and they don't have the same accountability or labor standards or sharing the wealth. And they also don't have, the state doesn't have the support system to really demand the accountability of the companies. So I think we have to think very much about that, you know, this caller's question is very important about how do we find ways to build alliances with workers that and communities that that provide avenues and pathways for change.
Thank you. Anybody else who would like to comment on the alliances from the panelists?
If I can, yes.
Sure.
Um, I mean, obviously, it's a very important question that's brought up, and also, I think one thing that shows quite clearly that the kind of difficulties in enabling a transition when petroleum interests are so kind of tend to be prioritized by society and by the state is the COVID crisis package to the oil industry in Norway that kind of gave them because there was a fear during the corona pandemic that there would be too little revenue from oil, and then the jobs would be at risk, and they got this crisis package that basically if they submitted a new plan for development and operation for an oil and gas project by the end of last year, so by the end of 2022, then they would get like special tax breaks that make it more profitable to start projects that might be marginally profitable or not really profitable without that package. And by the end of the year, 30 new projects came in under that package, let's say, and that's about 400 billion Norwegian kroners in total, like new projects and new investments in the petroleum industry. And that doesn't just mean more investments in petroleum. That also means that the workers, the industries that like might have built wind turbines for offshore or other kinds of green projects are now bound up with delivering to the petroleum industry for these new projects for years ahead. And so that creates like these again, like these difficulties of actually enabling a transition, because now so much labor capacity is bound up to petroleum for quite a long time and to the future.
Thank you. And as we have a couple of minutes left, Vivian, I would like to ask you the last question, which is also one of our digital audience has sent in. Thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate your film. He's the person writing. I just have one question to you, please. In Europe, the Just Transition's main focus is on coal. And in fact, the EU Just Transition mechanism is mainly targeted to support the coal industry to not leave any worker behind when they are phased out, especially when it comes to particular regions. Did you focus on gas because of Norway's energy mix? Would you consider to make a similar film for the coal industry? For example, comparing USA, Poland, and Australia, just to mention 3 different continents. Thanks a lot, and congratulations for your excellent work.
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's important to represent so many different sectors. Certainly coal is still very critical, and we see it reviving, and that is, and in Poland it's still huge, in Australia as well. So I'm not the only filmmaker around, but of course I would love to be invited to work with people who are interested in using film. And I know Ragnhild also uses cultural vehicles, in popular culture and performance, to try to stimulate dialogue and shed light, right, on the different perspectives. I think that's really a wonderful way to get people, again, to find ways so that we are not screaming at each other. Maybe we still do feel, polarized even when we see a dialogue taking place. But coal's very important. I'd love to be involved in any project that did work on coal or advise people. So thank you.
So maybe the next project on Nicole. Closing today's conversation, I just wanted to ask the last question to all the panelists to give a short comment, as we have 4 minutes left, so 1 minute each. Going back to the labor unions, as that was also a prominent topic during the conversation today. What do you see the role of, what is the role of labor unions in the transition? And how can labor unions mitigate risk for their workers to be left without a job at the same time as they work to save our climate? So if we go back to our workers that we saw in the film today. Ragnhild?
I think unions have a critical role to play, and I think that more dialogue is needed between the unions and the labor and the environmental organizations. For example, there has been an initiative in Norway, the Bridge to the Future Alliance, for I think almost a decade now, at least. But also there's a need for that kind of conversation also to be prioritized in politics as well, so that, because it's the role of politics also to ensure that the transition is just, particularly in a country like Norway that has like democratic structures, but really everywhere. I think that's really important, because the unions have an important role to push policy, but also policy change needs to happen to enable green transition jobs to be just and secure and have good working conditions as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Austin, last comments?
Thank you very much. I think that when we go back to the issue of the union, I think that I go back to my earlier comment about context, that in many transition economies, in many developing countries, not least Nigeria, where Vivian had a worker. When you listen to the worker from Nigeria, clearly the labor union is concerned about protecting the interest of workers, right? And it goes back to the issue of what is green transition and what does it mean for whom. In many African countries, talking about energy transition is not a border, it's not a priority to any labor union, simply because even states themselves are not concerned about energy transition. They are concerned about how they can get profits, they can get taxes from oil companies in Nigeria, they can protect the environment and all of that. So you realize that the context makes the issue very complex when you look at the case of Nigeria and many other African countries. So I think that at this current moment, it could be a conversation, but I don't think it's a priority for any labor union when we talk about energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. Marianne?
Yes, I also agree with Ragnhild and Austin that labor unions are extremely important right now in this phase of transition, where there is so much vulnerability, and jobs are at stake, and the industry is changing quickly, even though it's going to take years. But and I think the unions should be there should be more knowledge, like there should be knowledgeable people in the unions that are able to also make connections to other unions in other segments of the industry. And I'm talking about the point of view of the seafarers and their unions. Their unions, they seem a bit detached from the whole industry. And it seems to me, or from the stories I've collected, that the rig worker or the unions of the oil workers are stronger in a way. So there should be more conversations across segments of the industry and the unions, but they are extremely important. Everybody should unionize.
Thank you also for the encouragement. And
Yes.
Vivian?
Yeah, I think unions have the ability to be a democratic voice in society, whether anywhere in the world. But it is important for unions to find ways to benefit not only their members, but to work for the common good. And we see, you know, in the United States, there's been more possibility of, you know, teachers' unions and nurses' unions and public sector and even building trades unions that are fighting to retrofit schools and hospitals. I mean, there are jobs and there are ways to create work that's valued in a society that does take care of more people than we see happening now. I think it's very interesting to ask questions about the Global South, that things are different there, but they're also, unions have a critical role to play. They tend to be more vulnerable and have less independence either from the government or from companies, but it's an area that I'd like to see, again, as Austin said, put more emphasis in the research space and to bring workers and their unions into the conversation when we talk about transition.
So one of the important points to take from this conversation is more conversations between segments and people. Thank you, Vivian, for your wonderful film, for giving this opportunity for all of us to gather together and talk. Thank you, all the panelists, for joining our conversations and for the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye, everybody.